And good day. We are coming on the air with more breaking news. President Trump posting on his Truth Social platform that he has fired Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and that he will nominate Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin to become the next DHS secretary. The president writing, quote, "I am pleased to announce that the highly respected United States Senator from the great state of Oklahoma, Markwayne Mullin, will become the United States Secretary of Homeland Security effective March 31st, 2026. I want to bring in Chief White House Correspondent Peter Alexander. Peter, when I spoke with the president just a few weeks ago, he still had a lot of confidence in Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, pointing to the border, but something has changed over the last few weeks. And what was it?
Well, it's interesting, Tom, you make that point. So this news, I think you can say, is stunning, but it's not surprising. We know the president has grown increasingly frustrated by Kristi Noem's performance as the Department of Homeland Security secretary, most notably after a series of events that took place over the course of the last several days where she was testifying before Congress. She had been asked a series of questions specifically about the role she played in approving contracts, and notably one, a $220 million ad campaign that was used to encourage immigrants to this country to self-deport. The senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy, said on that issue the president was, in his words, quote, pissed. During the course of the questioning, Noem told Kennedy that the president knew about her decision to approve the ad campaign contracts. You can imagine that did not sit well with the White House, certainly with the president as well. And so that appears to have been the tipping point in this moment. There had previously been some frustration by the president as it related to Noem for her handling of the operations, the immigration enforcement operations that had taken place in Minnesota. So what happens now? The president did not make clear in the course of this post who serves as Secretary of Homeland Security right now. Does Kristi Noem serve in that post until Markwayne Mullin can be confirmed? The president in his post said that Mullin will become the next Homeland Security Secretary. Obviously, he needs to be confirmed first. He is a popular Republican. It does not appear, with Republicans maintaining a majority in the Senate, that would be a problem, but it doesn't happen with the snap of the finger, as the president indicated on March 31st. So there are a lot of details still here to be ironed out. And Tom, notably, you talked about your conversation with the president airing in part during the Super Bowl and the week leading up to it. I was revisiting part of the comments that the president had you at that time. You asked him specifically about Kristi Noem and if he had confidence in her, and he really didn't speak about Noem specifically, but about the way he and his administration has handled the border. Your interview may have given us the first sort of sense of some of the frustrations that were beginning to build.
Peter, stand by for us. I want to bring in our senior Homeland Security correspondent, Julia Ainsley. Julia, it was just not the ad campaign that senators and congressional leaders were asking about. It was also about a plane, a private jet that you broke some news on. Get our viewers up to speed on that.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. It was just about 2 weeks ago. You and I were talking about these exclusive pictures that we obtained from an airplane that the Department of Homeland Security wanted to buy for $70 million. Those same pictures came back up at both the House and the Senate hearings this week, where Secretary Noem was pressured about why she wanted to buy this airplane and why it was supposed to be designated for deportees. She said that they would retrofit the plane, pull out the bed. This, of course, came with a bedroom, a bar, a kitchen, a large lounge, and 4 flat-screen TVs. This was the kind of luxury the senators were really pressing her about when it came to the spending decisions at DHS. She said that it could be retrofitted, but of course it begged the question, why would they not buy a regular plane for deportations in the first place? So there were a lot of questions that Noem at times struggled to answer, and there was a particular back and forth she had that really, we understand, rankled the president and bothered the White House when she was asked about that ad campaign. And she said the president knew that she was going to spend $220 million on an ad campaign that was supposed to encourage immigrants to self-deport. They said it ended up saving taxpayers money because those people were no longer in the country and deported on their own. But it prominently featured her. And of course, it really came as part of an image that some Republicans and certainly Democrats portrayed through those hearings, that Noem had been given a very wide berth when it came to approving contracts with her and her senior advisor, Corey Lewandowski, and that this was somehow a vanity project, that ad campaign really was to glorify her more than it was to do anything when it came to immigration. We should point out, though, Tom, that under her tenure, there was a record low number of border crossings at the southern border. Of course, that's to do with this administration's policy basically banning asylum for anyone crossing the border. But she has had some successes. And we know, of course, that her power in this administration began to diminish earlier this year after the fatal shootings of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretty in Minneapolis, both at the hands of DHS. And that was in large part after a surge in that area led by Greg Bovino, a Border Patrol commander, who reported directly to her. When the administration decided to pull back Bovino and send in Todd Lyons, that was the first signal that Noem's power within this administration may have been faltering.
All right, Julia, we thank you. I want to bring in our senior Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles. Ryan, you were watching these hearings yesterday. Tell us a little bit about those hearings. The administration started out with that DOGE campaign to really take money out of the government to stop wasteful spending. And then you had these hearings which were all about the ad campaigns and about these private jets.
Yeah, and oftentimes, Tom, these very public hearings that are televised broadly is something that the president is very specifically keened in on. And when his administration officials do well in those hearings, it usually raises their profile within the administration. And Noem took a brutal beating over the past couple of days, and not just from Democrats, but Republicans as well. This morning, I talked to Senator John Kennedy, who was among the Republicans that really asked some tough questions of Noem, specifically about that ad campaign that Julia was talking about. And Senator Kennedy, I should say, told me that the president called him after seeing that back and forth between Noem and the senator, and specifically said that his recollection, meaning Trump's recollection of who authorized that ad campaign, was different from the testimony that Noem provided in the hearing, that the president signed off on it and was aware of that ad campaign. So there was clearly a level of dissatisfaction among not just Republicans in Congress, but Democrats as well. There were countless numbers of Democrats that had called on her to step down or resign, or even perhaps threatened to move to impeachment proceedings.
Yeah. If you can, in 20 seconds, give us a preview of Senator Markwayne Mullin. What should we expect?
Markwayne Mullin is very much liked by members of the Senate, his colleagues, which will ultimately vote to confirm him. I have to imagine picking a popular senator that would have an easy confirmation process was part of the president's calculations when making this pick, Tom.
Ryan Nobles, we thank you for that. That's going to conclude this NBC News special report. We're going to have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now. We'll follow this breaking news and a full wrap-up tonight on Nightly News. We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.